We're in this series on Joseph that we're calling Live Strong Without Cheating. We're not trying to throw Lance Armstrong under the bus or anything like that, but it's a well-known fact that he won many trophies and became kind of a legend of his own in the cycling world, and then had it stripped from him because he'd been using some illegal drugs. And I believe that it parallels with the story that Jesus told of how he made the comparison between the man who built his house on the rock and the man who built his house on the sand. And that what foundation you build your life on will determine whether or not it can all be stripped away from you or whether it has lasting impact. And so I believe if you were to go to Lance's website called LiveSTRONG, he is doing some very good things with cancer research, things like that, and health. And you can actually get a lot of good benefit from there. And so hopefully maybe that will be his legend rather than the cycling world, because he's a cancer survivor. But if you live strong without cheating, you may not always feel like you're ahead, but you can live with yourself and you can live with the results of your life much more effectively and not feel like it's all can be blown away by the winds of life. And so Joseph, in my opinion, is probably one of the best examples in the scripture of someone who lives strong without cheating. Last week we talked about his temptation. We talked about a few weeks ago about his early relationship with his brothers and the challenges there. And we talked about how to live strong as a mom on Mother's Day. Today, we're going to talk about living strong when you feel trapped. When you feel trapped. And I believe every person experiences a feeling of being trapped sometime in their life, and sometimes a fair amount of their lives. And so, if you look with me on the list at the outset, if you grab your notes beside you there, if you'll look with me on this list, there's 7 things that I try to point out on a regular basis that have to do with what I consider to be the issues of life. And we're not going to camp out on them, but I just want to remind you of them. Some people feel trapped in their finances. Some people feel trapped in their career. Some people feel trapped in their relationships. Some people feel trapped in their emotions, emotionally trapped. Some people feel trapped in their mind. Some people feel trapped in their body. And some people feel trapped spiritually. Now, rather than for me to break down all of those individually, what I want you to do is have right now maybe identify one of those areas, or if it's another area, one of those areas where you're having a tendency to feel a little bit trapped right now. If it's finances, just keep that in mind or circle that. If it's your career, keep that in mind. If it's a relationship, emotions, mind, body, or spiritual life. Identify where it is right now that you feel somewhat trapped. And oftentimes we don't like to talk about this because if you feel trapped in a relationship, you feel like to talk about it could cause a lot of tension or difficulty or maybe even a break in the relationship. If you feel trapped in your emotions, you don't know who to trust always with what you feel like you need to say. Who's safe to spill your emotions to? So all of these areas, sometimes we're embarrassed if we feel trapped financially. We just feel embarrassed. And because we do focus on the fact of trying to help individuals become debt-free here, we'd like to just say, we encourage you to lay aside that embarrassment and just dive in, because there is help and there is a way to come out of that. But the scripture lesson we're going to take from Joseph's life today is found in Genesis chapter 39, all the way, starting verse 20 through 41, verse 9. Now, we're not going to read all those verses. I'm going to kind of tell you the story, and then we're going to refer to some verses as we go. And if you're familiar with the story, you already know it. If you're not, I'm just going to give you a thumb sketch of it very quickly. Joseph, as we talked about last week, was faced with this temptation by his boss's wife, his owner's wife, because he's a slave. She lied on him, and so the person who he belonged to put him in jail, put him in prison, put him in the king's prison. And then Joseph, while he was in the prison, he found favor with the warden. The warden placed him in charge of all the prison. And while he was there were two guys that had dreams. And so he interpreted their dreams for them. And if I would have been Joseph, I'd have probably been tempted to interpret the one dream properly and then tell the other guy I didn't know what that one was or something. Because for one of the guys, he was able to tell him in 3 days he's going to be restored as the king's cupbearer. For the guy who was a cook, he had to tell him in 3 days his head was coming off. He was going to be killed. And but he told them, and it happened. And so the cupbearer, he'd asked the cupbearer very carefully, please remember me when you go back. But the cupbearer, he didn't think about it for at least 2 years, and that took Pharaoh having a dream that was bothering him for him to bring it up. And so as a result, Joseph ends up spending an extended period of time here in prison for something he didn't do. Now you talk about trapped. I've been in jails, been in prisons, and there's something very eerie about walking through doors and hearing the clank of metal behind you, and walking through another door and hearing the clank of metal, and you're going, this is getting deeper and deeper. Prison, even where there's the most flexibility, it's still prison. I've never talked to anybody in prison, never met anybody in prison, never met anybody who's been to prison before who said, I don't want to get out, or I wish I could have stayed longer. I've never met anybody. I did read about one guy who had been in prison so long, he got out, he didn't know how to function on the outside, so he went in and robbed a bank so he could go back home. You know, he considered home. But that's a rare story. I mean, that's a rare story. But I've come to believe this, and even though that's a certain kind of entrapment that is really difficult and hard when a person's in that, I also have come to believe this. You do not have to be in prison to feel trapped or to truly be in prison. You can be living in the free world, so to speak, and be very, very trapped. So if you identified in some way with one of these areas that you might feel a little trapped this morning, I'm going to give you some pointers from Joseph's life that I hope will help you. And so when you feel trapped, I want you to remember these things. Number one, the Lord is with you. The Lord is with you. I want you to look at verse 21 of chapter 39, and it says this. I want to back up just a little bit to when he was thrown in. Joseph's master took him to verse 20, took him and put him in prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined. But while Joseph was there in prison, now this is where 21 starts, the Lord was with him. The Lord was with him. So you feel trapped today. You feel a little bit hopeless about something, maybe about a relationship, about your finances, about something in your life. You feel trapped. I'm here to tell you that if you're a believer in the Lord Jesus Christ, God is with you. He's with you. You're not alone. You may feel alone. You maybe haven't even shared what you're feeling, what you're experiencing with any other human being. But I need to tell you, you're not alone. The Lord is with you. Now, I want you, if you would, just for a moment, in just a moment, I'm going to ask you to bow your heads and close your eyes and to think about specifically what it is that you feel trapped in. You feel boxed in this area. And I want you to encourage yourself in the Lord by saying this to yourself. You can say it out loud if you need to, but to yourself. And you'll have to exercise faith, okay? You have to really believe it. Because if you don't believe it, just saying it won't make it. You have to believe the Lord is with you. So whether it's your finances, relationship, whether it's your emotions, anything else, right now I want you to bow your heads, close your eyes, and tell yourself, remind yourself the Lord is with you, and say it with faith, believing. Lord, we could come here and just do church. We could come here, sing our 4 songs, say a prayer, read a few verses, make some comments, go home, and just be like we were when we walked in. But Lord, if there's someone who came in here today that feels trapped, they need to leave here knowing they are not alone. You are with them. Joseph was far away from home, far away from family. He was a slave. He had no power, no control. He had been falsely accused. He was thrown in the slammer and left there to perish. And yet, your scripture in telling this story says, you were there with him. Help every person here to believe that whatever is the most intense issue going on in their lives right now, you are here with them right now, and you'll go with them when we leave here today. In Jesus' name. Number 2, God will show you kindness. God will show you kindness. Look at the rest of verse 21. It says this, while Joseph was there in prison, the Lord was with him. He showed him kindness. He showed him kindness. Do you believe that God is a kind God? You know, we get a little mixed up sometimes about who God is. God is a God to fear in the appropriate sense, to revere, to respect, to understand that he is all-powerful. He can do anything. But we also have to understand that God is governed by his own personhood. In other words, he can't be untrue to who he is. And his nature is not only righteous, but his nature is also love and mercy and kindness. And no greater demonstration of that has there been except through him sending Jesus Christ. So when I get a little bit confused about who God is, here's something that I like to do. I like to start reading the Bible where it talks about Jesus and where Jesus speaks, because all of a sudden I begin to get a perspective of God that I think is correct. Jesus said himself, if you've seen the Father, you've seen me. And so God will show us kindness. Most of the times, he shows us kindness through people, through circumstances. You know, it's not so much, God writing a big message in the sky. It's through the events of life, through the people we're connected to, that God shows us his kindness. And so I don't know if you know of situations, you can think right now of situations in your life where you've seen the kindness of God demonstrated. But I think if you think about it, you'll see those. I even just in recent weeks have witnessed the kindness of God in some people's lives right here in this body. And I will have to tell you, one of the most convincing things to me, even in my own relationship with God, is as I look over the years, I can point time and time and time again to the God's kindness toward me. In the moment, sometimes I didn't see it. But in hindsight, I could see the kindness of God demonstrated over and over and over again. Things that I was concerned about, things that I was upset about, things that I felt distraught about sometimes. Looking back, I could see how God was kind there. He was kind here. He was kind in this situation. And it's wonderful. I actually didn't pick up the phone. Someone called me. I didn't pick it up, but they called me this week. And there was something that was bothering me. And this person spoke life into my spirit. And you know what? They didn't even know it. They never even knew that they did. But I see that as the kindness of God, speaking, reaching out to us in ways that we can feel, we can experience. And so sometimes I think we're looking for God to drop the big bucket down or something, for him to do the big thing, for him to, do something that's going to make the news in our lives. Maybe if we just watched for the simple ways that God shows his kindness to us, we'd be much more aware of it. Number 3, God's favor will affect how others see you. Look at still in verse 21, going down to verse 22. It says that after he was put in prison here, the Lord was with him. He showed him kindness and granted him favor in the eyes of the prison warden. So the warden put Joseph in charge of all those held in the prison, and he was made responsible for all that was done there. The warden in this prison saw something in Joseph that he didn't see in any of the other prisoners, obviously. And many of these were people who were served in the king's quarters, who were thrown into this prison, this given prison. So it wasn't like that everybody in there was a scumbag of some kind or whatever. Many of them had lofty positions, just like the cupbearer, the guy closest to the king, proximity-wise. And then his chief cook was in there, and we don't know who else, but people who had come from some of the high officials in the kingdom at that time, and they were in there. And so these weren't just people off the street. These were people of some notoriety. But somehow the warden saw something in Joseph that was absolutely different. And what we know is God affected his heart to see something different in Joseph. And let me just say that whenever you know God, whenever you live for God, that God will oftentimes show his favor through people who would never by themselves choose to show you favor. I've seen God change people's minds who didn't even follow God because God was up something bigger than them, but they had a position of power. So he worked through them to change and affect their hearts to do something they maybe wouldn't have done without God's influence on their heart. And so I don't think this warden was sitting there and thinking, well, I really respect Joseph's spiritual life. He probably didn't even understand what a spiritual life was, but what he saw was something that made him show favor to Joseph. And so what I want to say is this: when you walk with God, God will use circumstances, people, situations to show his favor to you. And I'm a little concerned that sometimes as believers, we're a little bit too caught up on living out a life of shame rather than living out a life of favor, of God's favor. Joseph, I don't think he was trying to do anything other than follow God. But in his following of God, God honored him with his favor. And he found favor with him. Now, I want to say a couple things about wardens, okay? I have, as I mentioned, gone to a number of jails and a number of prisons. And I currently engage in some of those right now. And I want to tell you, when you walk into a prison door and you walk up to the counter, I don't walk up to that counter and say, excuse me, I am Reverend Rodney G. Addison, and I'm here to do it. I might introduce, if I'm going as a pastor, I might introduce myself as a pastor in the purpose of doing that. But I've literally had them take my pocket credentials of my ordination. I've literally had them look at that and go, anybody go to Kinko's and make that? And kind of laugh at it. Because there are people sometimes who pose as pastors to take contraband into prisons. So they don't, titles, whatever you are, whatever, you know what I mean? It doesn't mean anything. I mean, you have to have super official paperwork to prove anything today. Used to be years ago when I was really starting as a pastor, you could kind of walk into any situation and, if you kind of look like a pastor, smelled like a pastor, whatever, they'd let you go on in, whatever that is. Don't let your imagination go too far there. But what I want to tell you is, wardens, they don't give a rip about who you are. I'm talking about outside people. There's been a couple of times I've wanted to say to them, look, I'm not a criminal. I'm not inside there. I'm out here talking to you. You're acting like I'm a criminal. But see, they go ahead and assume you're up to something. They go ahead and assume you're trying to sneak something in here. And so you don't walk in there. You're not innocent by walking in. You go, well, I didn't do anything wrong. I'm just coming in here to visit somebody. I'm just here. Well, get ready to be humiliated. I mean, there was this older lady going through in front of me, and she kept making the beeper thing go off. And they said, ma'am, do you have a wire bra? And she just no, whatever. And she kept making it go off, and they're going, and they checked, embarrassingly checking her all over, And finally they said, do you know what we mean by a wire bra? Yes, I know. And she was like this grandma getting pretty huffed up here, But it's like they were ready to march her out. Didn't matter if she looked like a great little grandma or not. You're making this thing go off, and they'll humiliate you. It doesn't matter. You have to prove. You can't just walk in and say, hey, I'm so-and-so, and I'm doing this. You have to prove your innocence. You have to prove it. That's not how we're used to living. So wardens really don't, a warden's job is basically this: keep order. And if I have to use drug lords or gang members or something else to keep order, we use whatever we can just to keep some sense of order. That's what we do. That's how it is. Whether you like it or not, that's how our system works. They feel about as in charge as a split second in those places. And so they use any means they can, and so everybody's up to be used. And so you even walking in as a citizen who's not a criminal, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. So for Joseph, he's coming in as a prisoner. For this guy to say to him, man, I just see something different that I can just put you in charge of the whole prison. First of all, there's a lot of back and forth and henpecking and stuff like that, pecking orders and all that in prison. So Joseph, in a sense, just by being in charge, set himself up to really come under some pressure. And I guess he was given some authority, and it sounds like he handled it well. But I'll just have to tell you, this is a very unusual circumstance for him to have been placed in charge of the whole prison. And it says something about Joseph and his character in his life that's much greater than we can read from these pages. It's an amazing testimony to who this guy was and to how he lived. But it's also an amazing testimony of God's favor on a person's life. Because see, what I think God specializes in is taking average, ordinary, everyday people, and by his Spirit living in us, helping us to become extraordinary people. I think the greatest compliment we could ever have is for someone to come up to us and go, that was so awesome. I would never have expected that of you. Now you could take that as a slam for someone to say, I would have never expected you could do that. But see, if it's something in the spiritual realm, if it's something that God's doing in your life, or if it's something in the everyday realm, but it's because you're a follower of God that you live for excellence, you pursue excellence, and you've pursued beyond what people might have thought you could do, then I just think that's got to be a great compliment, because what that means is what you did was more God-sized than your size. And God has a way, of what do they call it when you drive through, like the fast food places? Do you want to what size it? What? Supersize. That's it. Okay, thank you. I just couldn't think for a moment what it was. You want to supersize it. That's the reason most of us look supersized. Anyway, we live in a supersized culture, But so here we're going along, and God, in all of our lives, what he wants to do is supersize some things so that when people look at us, they're going, there's no way that guy could do that. You know what I want? I want people's lives to be changed so dramatically here at Westtown. I want things to happen here that are so beyond what I could do, what you could do, what we could do even together, that we have to go, only God could do that. If we don't have some only God could do that, then it's just up to us. I guess we're just doing the best we can do. I want to do beyond what we can do through the power of Christ that works within us and his favor that is on us. Number 4. God can put you on top at the bottom. I know it's an odd statement, but let me explain it. Joseph had every reason in the world at this point to have the biggest pity party anybody's ever had in their life. I mean, here he was, a kid who told on his big brothers because they were doing bad things, and turned around, they hated him for it, literally hated him for it. They hated him enough to kill him. But instead of killing him, they decided to make a little money on him, sell him. Here he is, a person who had favor with his dad, who now is a slave. Literally at this point, almost ceases to have his human identity. It's like stripped from him. It's taken away. Now he is owned by people, sold as a slave. Now he's owned by a high-ranking official within Pharaoh's system. He's owned. And then that owner, to save face and whatever reason that he did because of his wife's lies, throws him in this dungeon, this prison, and he's left there to languish. Now, if you do something wrong, we all seem to have some sense of expectation that maybe we would get a certain kind of punishment. I've even talked to many people in prison who have simply admitted, this is where I should be. I've done wrong. I deserve this. But if you know, absolutely know you didn't do anything to be there, then at that point, there comes a point of desperation saying, doing good doesn't matter. Doing the right thing doesn't matter. What does it get you? I don't even know if God exists. If he does, he must not care. Here I am. Look at where I am. And I have no recourse. I can't even get, in this situation, he wouldn't even, as a slave and being right in the king's prison, he wouldn't even be able to get a public defender. I mean, he had nothing to turn to, period. Stuck in prison. But obviously, he didn't go over in a corner and suck his thumb. Obviously, he didn't. I don't think he was happy being there, and I think we'll see some of that flushed out a little bit as we go. I think he was frustrated. I think he was a little angry. I think he had a lot of the same emotions we would feel, but he didn't do what a lot of us would do. See, this is a place where a lot of people get out of the game. This is a place where a lot of people quit. It's too much. I don't know if you've ever said it before, when just one thing after another happens, so you go, it's too much. I can't take anymore. And I literally have watched and seen, sometimes felt it myself, where it's like, God, not one more thing, please. And I mean, if this meant to strengthen me, man, it's killing me. And I have some friends that from years ago that right here in the Augusta area, they've just lost they had two boys. Their younger son died a few years ago, and their second son died very recently. They're probably about my age. No children, no grandchildren. It's over. My heart breaks. I don't know how you do that. I don't know how. I don't understand it. There's no earthly explanation for that. Sometimes things happen. It just feels like it's too much. But the other side of that is this. Your life's not over. And so you have to choose whether you're going to continue to live. Certainly heal, but going to continue to live. Joseph obviously chose to live. He chose to go on. No one knew him. No one knew his background. No one knew his stuff. He chose to go on. And you know what? He ended up becoming a big fish in a little pond. You might say, well, my world's so small, everything else. Well, just be the biggest fish you could in the pond you are in, okay? And I don't think Joseph set out to do this. He just set out to go ahead and embrace life, live life every day, and take it as it was, meet it, and still continue to do the things he knew that made his life have quality, have a relationship with God, endeavor to walk with God, have a meaningful relationship there. And I think oftentimes, I will tell you this, I don't believe this is why God does it. I don't know. I can't give the answer to all that. But I do believe this. When it seems like almost everything is stripped away from us is the time we really find out who we are. And there have been sometimes I've told God, I feel like I pretty well know who I am. Could we do some things differently now? And so when things get stripped away, we really see ourselves kind of for how we are. We really find out who we think God is in those moments as well. But I want to tell you, you may be down and out, but God can lift you up even in a down and out place to a certain point. Not be where you want to be, but it's better than where you would have been or where you were. Oftentimes people give up at this point of being at the bottom, but I believe if we do our best wherever we are, whatever the circumstances are, we'll find ourselves rising back to the top. Joseph was still in jail, but he became the top dog just under the warden in jail. And I will have to tell you this, I've noticed this in prisons too. When people become trustees or become trusted, they don't get to leave jail, but you know what they get to do? They get a lot more freedom than the person who's just stuck in their area and that's it. And so it's not, you know, I've seen them stacking chairs, doing all kinds of things, just so they could get out of the cell block, just so they could get out of, they'll come down, they'll work, they'll do other things, just because it gives them a little bit more of a life. So there are people who've learned and gained trust, and they can do some things that others can't do because of that. And so sometimes we may still be trapped, but what I say is maximize on what we can while we're trapped, because it will benefit us greatly when we're out of the trap. Number 5, look for opportunities. If Joseph had only been sitting around sucking his thumb, he wouldn't have been sitting around when these guys were talking. And in verse 8 it says, these guys came to him, and they had sad faces, and he asked them, why are you so sad today? And they said, we both had dreams, they answered, but there was no one to interpret them. Then Joseph said to them, do not interpretations belong to God? Tell me your dreams. Joseph did not say, hey, I'm the smartest guy you ever met. I can do this dream thing, man. I'm like, hey, I'm all that, you know. The Fonz thought he had something going. I'm really cool. And don't tell me you guys are all too old to know who the Fonz, anyway, no, I'm just too young or whatever. But, and I really don't know what the Fonz was or what he did, but anyway, myself, so it just came to my brain, I said it, sorry. Whatever image that conjured. Let's bring it back to Joseph, okay? Leave the Fonz behind. He spoke up. He saw an opportunity to help somebody, and he took the opportunity. Well, one guy, you could say he didn't help all that much, probably had a pretty miserable 3 days after he found out his neck was going in 3 days. But Joseph was able to interpret the dream, not by his own wit, not by his own power, but through God's help. And so he honored God, but he looked for opportunities. Number 6, ask for help. You know, sometimes we sit around, we molly-grub, we find ourselves in a situation, and we you know, and you say, well, have you talked to this person? Have you thought about calling this situation or these people or this, you know, just you start giving suggestions. Here's what I find. If you start giving suggestions to someone and they boo-hoo everything, I hate to tell you, but they're kind of enjoying being trapped. That's become their new identity. Well, I already tried, blah. You never quit asking for help. Because sometimes you can't get yourself out of your own trap. You know, it's been a couple time periods in my life, I've had to go counseling. I've had to get a professional counselor to sit down with me. And you go, well, that's not a mystery to us, Rod. We'd figured that out already. You know, you needed that probably. But you can't be afraid to ask for help. Verses 14 and 15 of chapter 40 says this. But this is Joseph talking to the guy who he gave the interpretation to that was going to go back to the king. He said, but when all goes well with you, Mr. Cupbearer, remember me and show me kindness. Mention me to Pharaoh and get me out of this prison. Joseph's going, man, say a good word for me. I mean, you're the cupbearer. You're sitting right by the king. Would you speak up and say something in my favor? Would you speak favorably? Get me out of this prison. This is like, man, this is my only chance right here. I am jumping all over it. He's going to me, don't you remember I interpreted this dream for you? Remember when things are going well for you. Help me get out of this prison. And he goes on to say this, for I was forcibly carried off from the land of the Hebrews, and even here, I have done nothing to deserve being put in a dungeon. I mean, he's appealing. He's going, look, man, I mean, God's being good to you, and he gave me this interpretation. You know you're going back to freedom. Would you please help me out? I will tell you this. If we get desperate enough, we will ask for help, hopefully. And if you are not willing to receive help or ask for help, it's probably a really good indication you need it. Number 7, just because you do right doesn't guarantee the right thing will happen. Look at verse 23. The chief cupbearer, the guy we're talking about, that Joseph gives this great plea to, explains to him, I'm absolutely innocent. Please remember me. The chief cupbearer, however, did not remember Joseph. He forgot him. I mean, how do you like that? He greeted his wife and his kids and, his cousins and his uncles and his aunts, and he's going, hey, guys, it's great to be free. I got to get back to work. I got to go in there and, test out his supper, the king's supper. He's in there, so he's been back in work. He just gets right back into his life like this never happened. Forgets about him. Don't raise your hand, please. Have you ever felt forgotten? Man, I thought they cared. I thought they knew. I thought you possibly could even feel forgotten by a person sitting real close to you. How could they forget that I said that? How could they forget this is how I feel? How? I think this is a really hard pill to swallow. You do the right thing, and it doesn't seem like things work out. I believe this is a place where people either draw closer to God or they start shoving him away in their lives. I've said this before. Well, I did this and this. I've said this to God. I probably even said it to some people. I did this and this. How did we end up with this result? How did this happen? I thought your promises were true, God. I believe I did this right. How did this happen? True faith trusts God and believes God even though we feel confused like crazy about what in the world God is doing and how he's working. It seems like the equations aren't working out. His algebra is coming out different than ours. We add this together, that together, subtract, multiply, all this stuff in, and we're going, man, this is the result. This is a result we should get from this. And it doesn't seem like that's the result you get. It's a huge spin-out point for people when they're following of Jesus. But it's also a place where people can dig deep, hold steady, and be strong in the Lord and watch and see what he's up to. Now let's go on to number 8. 2 years trapped seems like a lifetime. Look at verse 1 of chapter 41. When 2 full years had passed, this was in a year and a month, this was in a year and 3 months. When 2 full years had passed, Pharaoh had a dream. Here's the trigger point for this guy's memory, okay? But 2 years passed. Joseph, I know most of us that are getting a little age on us, 2 years seems like nothing. But I will tell you this, 2 years in prison, that can feel like forever. It can feel like forever. It can feel like it will never end. It can seem like an eternity. And today, we're not just talking about prisons like Georgia Corrections. We're talking about the kind of prisons in finances. We're talking about the kind of prison of a career, your relationships, your emotions, your mind, your body, your spirit. We're talking about that kind of, that's the entrapment most of us feel here. Most of you aren't going to go to prison. You're not going to go to jail. You're not going to do that. But it doesn't mean you're not trapped. It doesn't mean you're not in prison in some way. So if you've been trapped for a while, that seems like a long time. You've been trapped 2 years. It seems like a really long time. It seems like it will not end. It seems like a life sentence. But I need to tell you that if you're a Christ follower and you're following, you may live a lifetime and things may not always work out exactly the way you hoped or thought they would. But I can tell you that everything I've stated here today, I believe to be true, not just in the life of Joseph, but I believe to be true as we look at how God works in people's lives throughout history. The Lord is with you. God will show his kindness. His favor will affect how others treat you. You can rise to the top when you're on the bottom, the top of the bottom. You can look for opportunities. You can ask for help. And you have to remember the last thing that I want to say to you. God is not in a rush, but he is always on time. God is not in a rush, but he is always on time. if there's one thing most of us would like to change about God, it might be this. If we could get him to work on our timetable, we feel like we'd be happier people. I don't know why Joseph needed to spend 2 more years there in prison, but he was a young man. I'm suspecting there were some aspects of his life that God was still refining in preparation for what he was going to do, what he was going to happen, and we're going to be talking about those things the next few weeks as he was elevated to assistant Pharaoh. But I need to tell you this. Quit, and I'm speaking to Rod. I could just jump right down here in the front row and listen to this too, okay? Quit putting God on your timetable. Here's what I believe. Joseph would have loved for him to go out here and just tell the king immediately, hey, I met this really cool guy in prison. They're having, sitting there and talking. Maybe they'd had supper and everybody else left, and the king's going, hey, cupbearer, can you hang around for some dessert? You got to test this dessert out before I eat it, and so we'll just sit here and have some coffee and dessert. Everybody else is gone, and they're sitting there and talking. And Joseph, this is probably what Joseph's sitting there imagining, his cot, or if he had a cot even in this dungeon. He's imagining, I bet you right now they're having dessert. And I can just picture that cupbearer going, I met the coolest guy in prison. You wouldn't believe this dude. Listen, let me tell you my dream. King, couldn't you interpret that dream? Could you interpret that? No, you can't interpret that dream. But this guy did, and let me tell you what he told me. And you know what I think the king might have done? Like, man, you got weird in prison. You think you bring some cellmate from prison here? And no, man, I do not want one of your jailbirds over here working with me. I mean, what does that matter to me? So he can interpret dreams, big deal. It might have had no impact, but all of a sudden the king has a need. And the need is, I've had a disturbing dream, and I can't get anybody to interpret it. And at this point, when they were having dessert and coffee, and everybody left, and he's telling the cupbearer about it, bearing his heart out there, a light bulb goes on. And all of a sudden, the cupbearer goes, this. The cupbearer said to Pharaoh, today I am reminded of my shortcomings. You know what I would like to say? I would like to say he wasn't reminded of his shortcomings. God he forgot because God gave him amnesia, And he remembered in this moment when the king would pay attention to who Joseph was because of what God could do through him. I just need to remind you, please remember 2 things particularly I want you to walk away from here with. Just because you do the right thing doesn't guarantee the right thing will happen. And God is not in a rush, but he's always on time.